Tonight on Tab, we're talking about autism. Yeah, autism, the condition that has brought us Temple Grandin, half of Silicon Valley, and 100% of all Dragon Ball Z fan fiction ever written. And look, if you've seen my videos before, you'll know I'm not speaking from the outside here. That's right. If you will, I'm a bit of a sommelier of neurodivergence, a real connoisseur of the quirky brain vintage. Strong notes of hyperfocus with a lingering aftertaste of sensory overload. Autism is a neurodevelopmental condition. It's not new, it's not rare, and it's not, despite what a number of sweaty anti-vax podcasters would have you believe, caused by Tylenol or by Wi-Fi or Pop-Tarts or whatever they want to blame. But one man is really interested in making you believe that it is, at least the Tylenol. RFK Jr., seen here cosplaying as the Temu version of 2024 Hermes handbag line, has been on a decades-long crusade to convince people that autism is caused by vaccines, and Mercury, and 5G, and fluoride, and Tylenol, basically anything other than what the actual science says. And look, autism is complicated. It deserves a serious conversation, but unfortunately RFK Jr. treats it with all the nuance of a Facebook boomer meme about Bill Gates. So tonight, let's actually get this right. What autism is, what it isn't, and why RFK Jr. should probably be legally required to have a warning label slapped across his forehead. So let's start with what autism is. Here's what we actually know. Autism used to be lumped in with schizophrenia until 1911 when researchers were like, no, that's a different thing. Today, it's called the autism spectrum disorder, and the key word there is spectrum. Autism is not a single ailment. It's a broad set of developmental pathways that can lead to similar behaviors, from trouble with social communication to sensory sensitivities to deep obsessive interests in things like Pokemon or the Roman aqueduct system, or frankly, the Pokemon aqueduct system, which I assume someone somewhere has diagrammed in meticulous detail, because what were they using in Pallet Town? In the old DSM-4, you had classic autism, Asperger's, EDD, NOS, Rett syndrome, and so on. But the DSM-5 collapsed all of those into levels 1, 2, and 3, based not on the type of autism or the condition, but the amount of support someone needs. Much before that, doctors used much blunter terms like normal autism and headbanging autism, which, I'll admit, would be a great name if I ever made an 80s Bon Jovi cover band, is probably not the appropriate way to talk about someone's neurodevelopmental needs. So here's how the current system works. Level 1 is the need some support group. It's people who may struggle in social situations, but often live independently. Level 2 needs more substantial support. And level 3 requires very substantial support on a day-to-day basis. This is where severe and nonverbal patients are often. And then there's this whole subclinical, sometimes called the broad autism phenotype. They tick a lot of the boxes, but not enough to qualify for a formal diagnosis in terms of support. That might be up to 15% of the population, which means quirky, weird, introverted, or the guy who won't shut up about trains may not be a personality type so much as a neurodivergence. And honestly, if you've ever been cornered at a party by a guy explaining the entire Star Wars expanded universe in painstaking detail, you are already aware that this group exists. So let's put it into some actual numbers. According to the CDC, about 2.8% of US kids meet the criteria for autism. Of those, 55% are level 1, and within that group, 80% have an average or above average IQ. Which means statistically, most autistic people are basically that one kid at high school who was brilliant at math, but ate alone in the computer lab at lunch. And if you're thinking, wait, we didn't have that kid at my school, I have bad news for you. It was probably you. Level 2 autism is about 0.8% of the population, and level 3 autism, the group needing the most support, is about 0.5% of the population. But here's the problem. RFK Jr. wants you to think that all autism is level 3. Let's look at this clip.
Autism destroys families. These are kids who, many of them were fully functional and regressed because of some environmental exposure into autism when they're 2 years old. These are kids who will never pay taxes. They'll never hold a job. They'll never play baseball. They'll never write a poem. They'll never go out on a date. Many of them will never use a toilet unassisted.
He literally said autistic people don't pay taxes, don't go on dates, don't play softball, and don't use the toilet unassisted. Now, there is a lot to unpack there from a man who looks like he might be actively dying while giving a speech, but let's start with the bathroom. In reality, 0.5% people are level 3 autistic. And within that group, fewer than 12% need bathroom support. That means just 0.06% of the entire population. So no, Bobby, autism doesn't mean you can't use the toilet, but your statements sure as hell mean that you clearly can't use Google. So let's tackle RFK Jr.'s first big non-toilet related claim, that children are perfectly fine until they regress into autism around age 2 because of, quote, environmental factors. Now, first off, yes, regression happens. Around 20 to 30% of autistic children appear to develop typically at first and then lose skills around 18 to 30 months. That's real. But it's not Tylenol or vaccines or Wi-Fi or even too many episodes of Paw Patrols, even though all parents wish they had an excuse to turn off these tail-wagging little bastards. Instead, it's something all kids go through, synaptic pruning, which honestly sounds like a great name for a hipster gardening service in Brooklyn. It's what your brain does around age 2. It goes through all the messy extra connections you built as a baby and says, wow, this is chaos. It is time to Marie Kondo this shit. As babies, our brains are like a Costco warehouse. Everything is in there. There are too many aisles, endless free samples, and you could theoretically learn Mandarin or calculus and the entire Pokedex simultaneously, but it's overwhelming. Around age 2, genes that regulate pruning kick in. They cut weaker connections and strengthen the ones that you actually use. If you live in the US, you prune connections to make English the focus. If you live in Japan, you prune for Japanese. If you live in Florida, you prune, I don't know, a sense of shame? Probably not. And this pruning explains why toddlers sometimes seem to lose skills they once had. It's normal. But in neurodivergent children, autism, ADHD, etc., the pruning process is dysregulated. Studies of autistic brains show that up to 50% more dendritic spines, meaning far more connections. Which sounds cool until you realize that means a noisy network. It's like trying to listen to your favorite song, but Spotify insists on playing every playlist in the world at the same time. But to make matters worse, the pruning isn't always selective. Important connections can be lost while random ones remain. So instead of a curated Spotify playlist, your brain is listening to one verse of Taylor Swift, 2 minutes of whale noises, and then 6 straight hours of the Seinfeld theme song. And that explains why autistic people can have both incredible strengths and big challenges. The wiring is uneven. And crucially, this process doesn't even start around until age 2, which means blaming Tylenol or vaccines makes as much sense as blaming a hangover on chicken nuggets that you ate 2 days later. Wrong timeline, chap. This is why genetics makes way more sense than environmental toxins. If autism were caused by Tylenol or vaccines, you would expect to see regression happen right after exposure. You'd also expect huge differences between exposed and unexposed groups. But that's not what we see. Instead, what we see is regression consistently happening at the same developmental stage, pruning. And it happens without any toxin exposure. But here's the nail in the coffin of this theory: twin studies. If autism were mainly environmental or medicinal, you would expect twins raised together to have very similar outcomes. But what do we actually see? Monozygotic twins who have identical DNA. If one twin is autistic, the other is autistic 70 to 90% of the time. But dizygotic twins who have half the DNA, if one is autistic, the other is autistic only 10 to 30% of the time. That's a massive genetic signal. It's not 100%. And why? Because pruning is probabilistic, not binary. Think of it like a dice game. Most people are rolling 10 dice. To get autism, you need to roll a combined score over 60. Basically, impossibly. But if you have the genetic risk, you are rolling 50 dice. Suddenly, the odds of hitting 60 are very, very high, but not guaranteed. And that's why identical twins can diverge. They've got the same dice, the same genetic risk, but the rolls come out different. Put another way, both twins play the same video game, but one drew easy mode, while the other spawned right into Dark Souls. So no, RFK, regression at age 2 is not evidence of Tylenol melting baby brains. It is evidence that you don't understand how human development works. Regression is the brain doing brain cleaning. In most kids, it's efficient. In autistic kids, it's chaotic. And that is genetics. It is not Johnson & Johnson. Which means, and I cannot stress this enough, if your entire medical theory can be disproven by identical twin studies, you need to stop reading Facebook groups and start reading literally anything else. Now, let's pivot entirely and talk about sperm. Yes, sperm. The Kardashians of the cellular world. There are way too many of them, they look suspiciously alike, and every new season seems to come with at least one mutation nobody asked for. And the reason that we need to talk about this is because one of the clearest factors for autism is paternal age. The older the father, the higher the chance. And no, it's not because your kid is embarrassed that you showed up to soccer practice in socks and sandals. Although apparently Gen Z is trying to bring that back, and frankly, I think that should be a war crime. And this isn't some abstract thing, it connects directly back to that previous claim. Those new mutations often hit the genes that are supposed to regulate how synapses are wired and trimmed, which means you can blame your dad for your autism, but it's not because he bought you a Nintendo instead of therapy. It's because biology is sloppy. Sperm stem cells are like overworked interns working in a copy room. At 20, they are sharp and caffeinated. At 50, they are drunk and crying in the bathroom and stapling pages together upside down. Or think of sperm like Hollywood reboots. The first few are okay, sure, maybe we make another Spider-Man. But by the time you're on Spider-Man number 12, the story is a mess. The cast doesn't jive, and Aunt May is suddenly a CGI dolphin. And if you really want to talk about how bad sperm can get with age, just remember, Donald Trump was 59 when Barron was born. And let's be real, that is 9 foot of walking autism right there. The point is, older dads means more mutations, which means more chances for something to go wrong in the delicate wiring of the child's brain. It doesn't guarantee autism. Most kids with older dads are fine, but the risk is higher. And this fits perfectly with genetic evidence. It does not fit with the Tylenol melted my baby's brain explanation, because unless Tylenol is sneaking into your testicles every night with a Sharpie, this one is on biology. Now, despite all the evidence about genetics and pruning and old guy sperm, RFK has spent decades promoting the myth that vaccines cause autism. His favorite villain, Mercury, specifically a compound called thimerosal. From 2015 to 2023, RFK Jr. was the chair of a group called the Children's Health Defense, formerly known as the World Mercury Project, which already sounds like a bad Marvel villain, World Mercury Project. Coming this fall to a Walmart parking lot near you. The group claims that thimerosal, which was used as a preservative in some vaccines, causes autism, ADHD, food allergies, cancer, probably male pattern baldness, and just about everything else. If you sneezed in the last 20 years, they think Mercury did it. But here's the problem. The science doesn't back it up at all. Thimerosal contains ethyl mercury, which is not the same thing as the mercury you're picturing in a cartoon thermometer. That's elemental mercury. It's also not the same thing as the methyl mercury that you find in fish. And this matters because methyl mercury hangs around in your blood for weeks and sneaks into your brain by disguising itself as an essential amino acid. Ethyl mercury, on the other hand, clears way faster and has less uptake past the blood-brain barrier. It is basically mercury light. A single flu shot with thimerosal is about 25 micrograms of ethyl mercury. Less than 1 microgram even makes it to the brain and clears quickly. By comparison, eating 1 tuna sandwich can use 4 or 5 times that same dose of methyl mercury, and that's the stuff that sticks. So if you're terrified of vaccines but happily crushing spicy tuna rolls at your local sushi place, congratulations, you're doing anti-science on hard mode. Methyl mercury in flu shots is a much smaller dose and less dangerous for you than the methyl mercury found in fish. You know, the exact same kind that RFK Jr. got mercury poisoning from. Yeah, that's right. RFK Jr. himself once testified before Congress that he had brain fog and memory issues, and then doctors found a dead worm in his brain. Which, first of all, Jesus Christ, Bobby, keep some mystery. Some of us would like to sleep tonight. But here's the kicker. Before that, he admitted to having mercury poisoning from eating too much tuna in Southeast Asia. He overdosed on tuna that raised his mercury levels sky high, and a brainworm showed up, and many have died from eating toxic brain. To put this in perspective, you could get your flu shot every year for your entire life, and because of the half-life of that mercury, you would never hit the same brain mercury level that RFK Jr. hit from eating fish. To match the levels in his brain, you would need thousands of flu shots in the same day, which, yes, will probably kill you, but only because you would drown in those tiny little alcohol wipes. Just to be extra safe, we did remove thimerosal from childhood vaccines back in the early 2000s. We did more research, found them safe, and added it back in. And during that time, rates of autism stayed the same, which is kind of a smoking gun that, shocker, thimerosal never had anything to do with it. In fact, because data was so clear, thimerosal is still used in multi-dose vials of flu vaccine all over the world. And you know what? No spikes in autism. None. Meanwhile, RFK Jr. is still out there yelling about Mercury with a brain so toxic the world gave up. So no, the aerosol does not cause autism. What it does is cause people like RFK Jr., a man whose brain was so toxic, even the parasite refused to live there. Like it had peeked inside the doorway of a filthy Turnpike Motel 6 and, I'm good. So it's truly remarkable that Bobby spent 30 years blaming vaccine Mercuries for autism, and it is also remarkable that despite the family history of the Kennedys, Bobby may genuinely be the one with the most brain damage. Now, one of RFK Jr.'s favorite slides is the big scary one that says autism is up 317% since 2000. Big font, red arrows. If a siren emoji could sue for overwork, this chart would be Exhibit A. It looks dramatic. It is also misleading, because those numbers do not measure how many autistic people exist. They measure how many we clocked, how many people reported a diagnosis of autism. Think about it as finally putting your glasses on and discovering your living room had a coffee table this whole time. You did not summon the coffee table by looking. You just stopped banging your shins. Let's walk through what actually changed in order with actual dates and receipts. First, in the 2000s, the CDC launches the Autism and Developmental Disabilities Monitoring Network. Before that, prevalence rates were stitched together from small, inconsistent studies that made your high school science fair look like CERN. The moment you create a standardized national surveillance system, count is going to go up. And it's not because kids suddenly mutated during the Clinton administration. It's because you finally used the same ruler in every single state and had a way to record that data. Second, in 2010, routine screening at 18 to 23 months became normal pediatric practice. Parents who previously were told, let's wait and see, began hearing, let's evaluate now. And when you start to look earlier, or just start to look at all, you're going to find more. Third, in 2013, the DSM-5 reorganized the categories: Asperger's, PDD, NOS, classic autism, childhood degenerative disorder. All of these things folded into the autism spectrum disorder was level 1 through 3 based on support needs. That moved a huge number of people who had previously lived in diagnostic purgatory into a label that matched their reality. This was not a rebrand like New Coke. It was finally shelving VHS tapes under the word films instead of rectangular plasticky filmy rings. Yes, a quieter shift that started even before the DSM-5, clinicians changed how they coded certain disabilities. Children who were once labeled as speech delayed or intellectual disability were reassessed and, when appropriate, coded as autistic, especially for level 3 presentations. Same children, better descriptions. And finally, the catch-up. For decades, we did not understand the differences in how autism presents in women, in minority groups, and honestly, we missed it in adults for decades. These people were ignored and now starting to get recognized. Autism did not skip these communities, we skipped them. Once community clinics, school psychologists, and health services learned what to look for, the numbers moved, because of course they did. Now, researchers have actually quantified this shift, breaking down each category in academic peer-reviewed papers. New criteria and registry coding represents 40 to 60%, according to Hansen et al. And Hertz-Picado et al. Reclassification from ID and speech delay to ASD, about 20%, according to the King and Bauman and Polyak et al. Papers. Early of screening, 18%. Same Hertz paper. Demographic catch-up, 10%, according to the ADDM from the CDC. And that leaves an unexplained remainder of only 5% of new cases over 25 years. 5% over a quarter century could be anything from better survival of preterm infants to plain statistical noise. And if your takeaway from that pie is Tylenol did it, I have a very exciting franchise opportunity of beachfront property for you outside of Des Moines. And yet every time you show this, some guy pops up with that sepia chart from 1974 that reads Autism 0. And he looks smug as if he has discovered Atlantis in Costco. No, what you had in the 70s was bad data and worse funding. You had entire neighborhoods where the HOA ran on a shared model train. You remember that uncle who worked for 50 years as an accountant, built an HO-scale replica of the Amtrak Northeast Corridor across 3 rooms and a laundry alcove, and programmed the AEM7 train to leave Trenton at 8:07 sharp with the correct sound pattern. That was not quirky. He was autistic. We lacked the vocabulary. He did not lack the traits. Undiagnosed women, do not get me started. Joanne Fabrics was moving so much yarn in the 1970s, it could have qualified as strategic infrastructure. The macrame craze was not just bohemian chic. It was a generation of brilliant autistic women channeling their focus into textiles because at the time, for them, STEM was the calculator that you had to sign out from the librarian. The bigger point is that the prevalence curves reflect measurement. When you widen the doorway, more people fit through. And that does not mean a new species appeared in the foyer. It means the foyer finally had a fucking door. And I get why the epidemic framing is tempting. It offers a villain. It gives a single cause and a silver bullet. It is narratively tight. It lets politicians stand at a podium and point to a household product like he's doing a prop comedy set saying, this is the problem. But it isn't. The world is messy and brains are messier. Autism is a pattern of development and not a toxin town. The epidemic story collapses the second you compare it to the actual economy of the curve. The steepest steps line up with policy changes and not product launches. Surveillance in the 2000s, screening around 2010, the DSM-5 in 2013. Demographic catch-up continuing through the 2010s, and if you want to blame a single event, blame the moment the pediatricians started using checklists, which, to be clear, is a good thing. Here's the sanity test. If autism were ballooning because of new exposure, you would expect a cliff by the birth cohort when that exposure changed. Thimerosal was removed from most childhood vaccines in the early 2000s, no cliff. Screening expanded in 2010, big step. DSM-5 in 2013, another step. This is what it looks like when measurement catches up with reality. And so when RFK Jr. says autism is exploding, what he's really doing is stapling a scary narrative to a curve he doesn't understand. It's performance statistics. It's the graph version of clapping to the wrong beat. And the irony is that real data makes the story more hopeful. Earlier screening means earlier support. Recoding severe presentations into ASD routes families to the right services. And recognizing autistic girls and adults opens doors that were welded shut for decades. This is not a disaster movie. It is a slow fix to a long and boring problem. Paperwork. Which brings us to the next move in the misinformation playbook. If you can't sell an epidemic with the old villain, you find a new one. Enter Tylenol. The hump pain reliever now casts as the mastermind behind a generation of autistic children. Because, of course, if there is one thing our era loves, it's turning a household object into a Bond villain. But before we test that claim, we need to handle one concept that keeps on getting smacked around like a piñata at a 6-year-old's birthday party. Correlation. What is it? What isn't it? And why is shouting association not the same as proving cause? And we're going to do this next with examples. Big board and it's one stupid chart that somehow links dairy products to divorce in Maine. And if that sounds ridiculous, good. Because so is basing national health policy on Facebook groups and vibes. Correlation means that two things tend to show up together. That can be because one causes the other, or both share a common cause, or the universe is just trolling you and it's a spurious correlation. A real causal relationship looks like my blood pressure the instant RFK Jr. starts a sentence. That is cause and effect that you can set a watch by. But our brains get messy. We're natural pattern finders, and so if you give us two lines that wiggle vaguely in the same direction, we will invent a story with a villain, a hero, and a third act twist where Fluoride turns out to be a murderer and dating his half-sister, which is how you end up with entire careers based around shouting association like you found Excalibur. To prove, meet Tyler Vika, who has spent years compiling spurious correlations, and they are fantastic. Like this graph that shows the rate between Will Smith movies and power generation in Kosovo. Apparently, every time Will Smith did a movie, Kosovo plugged in another power plant, which I can only assume is because they needed to have more movie theaters because everybody wanted to watch H2. Or this graph, divorce rates and margarine sales. It seems the true homewrecker was margarine, not you. It's country crock. Or this graph showing kerosene used in El Salvador tracks nicely and is correlated to Google searches for attack by squirrels. Because the darker side of San Salvador, everyone knows that the best way to deal with a squirrel attack is by a flamethrower. And of course, one of my personal favorites, Matt Levine columns published on Bloomberg on a Wednesday tracking with nuclear power generation in France. France's energy policy rises and falls with one Bloomberg columnist publishing schedule, and so if we chain Matt Levine to his desk, we could end the climate crisis by Thursday. Take that, usually. In these examples, the nonsense is obvious. No one thinks that a condiment causes divorce rates in Maine, but the correlation gets trickier when the story sounds plausible. Take this one for example. American cheese consumption correlated with BlackRock's stock price. Now, maybe that's because BlackRock owns dairy farms and food processing plants. Or GMO use in Kansas corn and the number of Kansas postmasters. Maybe something tied to the declining overall population in Kansas. Bachelor's degrees in education and the number of proofreaders. Simple. The more educated we are in English, the less we need proofreading. And associate's degrees in liberal arts and Google searches for tummy ache. That one is easy. That is just the existential dread of trying to find a full-time employment and pay your bills with a 2-year liberal arts degree. I'm not lying. Each one whispers a tempting little narrative. Corporate consolidation, rural decline, the fall of proofreading, the despair of job hunting, and here's the punchline. It's all bullshit. They illustrate how easy it is to paper over random noise by telling an untrue story. None of those things I just said were accurate. This is why scientists have these things we call rules. They look for more than 2 lines marching together, and it's part of the reason why you don't put an environmental lawyer in charge of healthcare. They want temporality, the cause happening before the effect. They want dose response. They want consistency, biological plausibility, and controls on the confounders. And most importantly, an effect size that survives scrutiny and has reproducibility. Let's talk about just confounding factors for a moment. The classic example is a graph that shows ice cream sales correlate with drowning. Ice cream, however, does not lure you into a watery grave. Heat drives both. You're more likely to buy ice cream in the summer and more likely to go swimming, which means more people are drowning. But if you skip filtering through the confounding factors, you end up with headlines like, "New study shows rocky road fills lungs with water." And keep in mind when someone says it's worth looking into, we just don't know enough. It's bullshit. Because in public health, we do look a lot with massive data sets across countries over decades. And just because you were too busy watching college football or listening to your favorite podcast hearing we talk about chemtrails does not mean that the rest of us weren't doing academic literature. So when a politician runs on association from a loose observational review that barely controls for genetics, ignores multinational cohorts that actually control for genetics and environment, you are not watching science. You're watching a courtroom drama where the lawyer keeps objecting to the laws of math. Which brings us to Tylenol, because RFK Jr. and his friends are waiting around a review that hints at an association, while a far larger study that accounts for big confounding factors did not find an increased risk. We'll dig into both in a moment, but remember the ground rules that associations are leads and not verdicts. You need the rest of the checklist before you start yelling at bottles in a CVS aisle. And yes, we are going to talk about mechanisms, and we are going to talk about dose and twin studies, because twins are nature's randomized control trial with matching outfits. And by the end of that, if you still want to blame Tylenol, then you should also blame margarine for the collapse of marriage in Maine and set up a sting operation for squirrels. And look, if you told me I would be doing a news segment covering RFK Jr. and twins, I would not have thought his crime would have been academic. Alright, Tylenol. Finally, at Tylenol. The beige cardigan of medicine. The pill you take for a headache, a fever, or because the plain Wi-Fi made you want to chew drywall. RFK Jr. says it's an autism trigger, which is an interesting theory if your research method is stare at a squiggly line until a story appears. But let's deal with the studies that everybody keeps naming. On one side, we have Alquist et al.'s 2024 study. This was not a cute pilot study. It covered roughly 2.5 million children across multiple countries with adjustments for the stuff that actually matters, such as environmental confounders and genetics. And when you put all of that into the model, the result is clear. There is no association between amphetamine use and pregnancy and autism. On the other side, the thing that RFK and friends wave around is Prada et al. From 2025, which is an observational review of other studies. It pulls smaller studies with limited controls together and then whispers that there may be an association. And May isn't just doing heavy lifting in that sentence, it is doing fucking CrossFit. This is exactly the sort of hint that shrinks when you scale up and fix a methodology. And then there's the phrase association. Notice how it's not correlation, let alone causation. Pregnant people take Tylenol because they had pain or a fever. And those conditions, bundled with their own risks, with life circumstances that matter, infection, inflammation, stress, broken sleep, access to care, if you don't adjust for that, you are accusing a thermometer of causing a fever. And there's a name for this, confounding by indication. In this case, what the study actually found was women who have inflammatory conditions are more likely to have children with different ailments, such as autoimmune conditions, ADHD, autism, eczema, asthma, a host of other conditions. Some of those women are also more likely to take an increased amount of Tylenol because, and get this, inflammatory conditions mean more pain. And the basic logic checks are missing. If prenatal exposure contributes to autism, you expect a pattern. Early exposure should matter more than late. Higher doses should matter more than lower doses. The signal should get cleaner as you control for family background. And in careful work, the Tylenol signal does not sharpen, it fades. But the mechanism matters too. If you're going to claim that a common painkiller rewires fetal brains, you need more than a vibes-based flowchart. Acetaminophen is negative in standard mutagenicity assay and negative in vivo clastogenicity tests. In normal person English, it's not genotoxic. It doesn't go around tearing up DNA, including during pregnancy. And we know what it does at high doses. It wrecks your liver, and we know how to treat that. What it doesn't do is sneak into the womb and turn synapses into modern art. But this is also where the twin data comes back again and ruins the movie ending that RFK wants. Identical twins share DNA. If a common prenatal exposure, like Tylenol, were a big driver, you'd see it stamp an obvious footprint across twin and sibling designs. But as we noted earlier, we simply do not see that. Instead, what dominates is genetic signal. Same home, same womb, different outcomes, often enough to tell you that this is not a simple story of pill-in autism out. Now, here's the line you'll hear from a podium. We should at least look into it. We just don't know. We have looked into it for decades, cohort after cohort, registry after registry. When an effect is real, it survives better methods and grows more precise. When it isn't, it shrinks until basically it's a rumor with a confidence interval. The Alquist study did the grown-up work, a giant sample, genetic adjustments, environmental controls, and the spooky association vanished like RFK Jr.'s scientific rigor in a Whole Foods supplement. There is also a real world of harm scaring people off Tylenol. Pregnant people in pain don't become Zen monks. They stay in pain or they ride out high fevers, which carry their own risk, including to babies. Or they switch to unregulated alternatives from a wellness influencer who calls themselves Dr. Breeze. That doesn't protect anyone. It shifts from well-studied medicine to wishful thinking. And if you want to help families, you give them information, not vibes and a coupon code. And the idea that Tylenol causes autism has the same structural integrity of a paper straw in a milkshake. And yes, if you are a politician who has spent years promising the public a mystery toxin, this conclusion is inconvenient. Which is why the goalposts always move. First it was Mercury, then it was Wi-Fi, then it was 5G, then Tylenol, and then we're just asking questions. An RFK Jr. seen here as the offspring between a sloth and a Komodo dragon will keep pointing at household objects until something blinks, but science doesn't work that way. You don't win because a bottle looks guilty on television. Here is the adult answer that people actually deserve. Autism has deep genetic roots and complex developmental timings. A subset of kids regress around the pruning window. Family background matters, and early support changes outcomes. That is rich, it is hard, and it is real. It is less exciting than blaming a red cap bottle, but it has the singular advantage of being true. And that matters because truth fucking matters here. Because when we understand that reality, we can study actual support methods for individuals with severe autism. When we understand that in some subset, support and early interventions can change outcomes, we can help large cohorts of neurodivergent children be equipped with the right emotional and intellectual scaffolding to survive and sometimes even thrive in a world that isn't built for them. But we can't do that when we blame Tylenol or mothers being in pain during pregnancy. So no, Tylenol is not a smoking gun. And if you are going to set up public health and put it on fire, the very least you can do is bring evidence that doesn't collapse under the slightest scrutiny, which leads us to the next act. Because if you frame people with a fake cause, you need a miracle to sell them. And of course, they got one. Enter the folate treatment. And once you've made every parent who ever took Tylenol during pregnancy feel guilty, you need a miracle to sell them. This is where leucovorin comes in, also called folinic acid. It's a supplement with a name that sounds like a minor Habsburg prince who collects swords. And here's the pitch. Autism is a folate brain problem, and folinic acid fixes it. It's easy, it's elegant, it's marketable. But it leaves out the single most important fact. The condition that folinic acid helps with is a cerebral folate deficiency, or CFD. And CFD is a separate medical problem. It happens when folate can't get into the brain properly, often thanks to folate receptors and alpha autoantibodies blocking the transport. Folinic acid can sometimes slip through in a different biochemical doorway, and that is a clever workaround for CFD. It is not a cure for autism. CFD is not autism. It is not caused by autism. It does not cause autism. It is a condition that some people with autism may also have that can worsen certain shared symptoms. Now, let's be grown-ups and do the numbers that you all hear in campaign speeches. Roughly 10 to 15% of autistic people are nonverbal. Among those, somewhere between 40 and 60% show markers for CFD. Now, if we multiply that through, you are talking about a few percentage points of an entire autistic population, somewhere between 4 and 9%, who even have the specific issues that folinic acid can target. And within that group, some see language gains when they guess, I dose folinic acid. Not all, some. These studies are small, the results are mixed, and nothing about that changes someone's autistic neurology. Not to mention, the studies also found equal results in autistic patients having increased irritability, more sensory meltdowns, gastrointestinal distress, and that it dampened the effectiveness of other medications used, including ones to prevent seizures, which around 10% of individuals with severe autism. Now, 2 more reality checks. First, this is off-label for autism. The promising results are in CFD, and the strongest signals come when the kid actually tests positive for those folate receptors antibodies. This is not a sprinkle it on everyone situation. It is a confirm the biology and then maybe try the thing. Second, folinic acid is not harmless fairy dust. The doses being bandied about are in the order of 400 times the recommended daily adult dose given daily to children. Folate fuels cell division. That's literally what it's for. And it needs to be carefully studied for unintended consequences. You don't floor the gas on proliferation of cell division for years and assume nothing odd will grow in the garden. And no, we haven't studied that kind of dose long term because you can't get there naturally. To match it from food, you would be mainlining 6 shopping carts of loose leaf spinach every day. And at that point, your pediatrician isn't your biggest problem. But this is where the sale pitch gets ugly. Well-intentioned parents, desperate for help, are told there was a treatment for autism. They start mega-dosing a non-FDA-approved protocol at levels no one has ever tested. And then when the kid doesn't transform, they blame themselves or they double the dose. This is not support. That is turning parental love into a clinical trial with a checkout button. And notice the linguistic trick. The success stories are real, but they are CFD success stories. Kids who had a specific folate transport problem and saw language gains when that problem got treated. And that is worth celebrating, but it is not generalized into autism. You cannot make speech easier without changing who a person is. If you sell a cure, what you are really promising is a world where autistic people vanish. They done. They grow up. Now let's talk incentives here because the profit motive is not exactly shy. The largest U.S. retailer of non-prescription folinic acid, their top seller of it, California Gold Nutrition, which also happens to be iHerb's own in-house brand. And after RFK Jr., Trump, and Dr. Oz made their big announcement, that folinic acid stock reportedly sold out in October. What a coincidence. Almost like if you shout cure on television, the real action happens on a checkout page. But here's the fun part. Dr. Oz has a long-standing tie to that supplement business because of course he does. Dr. Oz used to be the global advisor for iHerb and owns as much as 25 million in stock in the private company. Stock he said he would sell if he got confirmed. But of course, since then he's given no public update, no financial disclosures, no divestment statement, and this is even though it's well past his self-imposed 90-day deadline. Here is the ethical version you will not hear on a rally stage. If a clinician suspects CFD based on symptoms in labs, a trial of folinic acid may help that problem, and sometimes that opens a door for language. Great. Do it carefully, monitor the side effects, reassess. But do not tell families this is a treatment for autism, because it isn't. It treats CFD for a subset at very high doses. This is a medical decision and not a campaign. Because once you call it a cure, you create two harms at once. You steer money and hope away from supports that actually change lives, like communication access, sensory accommodations, and education that fits the brain in front of you, and you nudge parents towards megadoses with unknown long-term risks, all to chase a promise that was never made by the data. Or to put it more bluntly, if your autism treatment requires a child to ingest the folate equivalent of 6 carts of spinach every day, you don't have a cure. You have healing crystals with produce. And that brings us back to the men selling this. RFK Jr. and Trump are not offering science. They're offering a story where fear creates a problem and the store sells the solution. And look, we've covered a lot tonight, so let's bring it out. Autism is a neurodevelopmental pattern. It is not a monster under the bed. It is diverse, it is common, and it has deep genetic roots and a developmental timeline that explains why some kids regress during pruning around age 2. The explosion in cases, that is measured. We started counting properly in the 2000s, we screened earlier in the 2010s, we recognized diagnoses in 2013, and we finally recognized women and minorities, adults who have been missing for decades. And we have the receipts for genetics. Identical twins match far more often than fraternal ones. Older paternal age raises the risk through de novo mutations. It is dice and not destiny. And it is why two kids with the same genetic load can roll different outcomes. That's why support matters. We've also cleaned up a few villains that never were. The Marisol isn't mercury from a cartoon thermometer, and the tiny bit of ethyl mercury ever reaches your brain from a multi-dose flu shot clears quickly. Your tuna sandwich moves the needle more. And in a turn of case, it moved so far that even the brain said no thanks. And then there's Tylenol, the big, careful study with Elkfist 2024, 2.5 million kids. It found no association between prenatal Tylenol and autism. The thing RFK keeps waving at, Prop to 2025, is the looser observational review with limited confounded control, where we may see an association. And that brings us to the cure, leucovorin, the phenolic acid, which is useful for a subset of autistic people who actually have cerebral folate deficiency, a specific transport problem you can test for that is real, but is also not autism. Treating CFD can help some kids, while still with language, and that is worth pursuing carefully. But dosing children hundreds of times the adult recommendation daily for years based on a rally soundbite, that is not medicine. You cannot be dosing your kids based on the whims of an environmental lawyer and a snake oil salesman. And speaking of Dr. Oz, the supplement aisle rings the bell. iHerb's house brand of California Gold Nutrition flew off the shelves right after the big announcement. And so this embarrassing public health address wasn't even so much about public health as it was a sales funnel so that grifters can continue to profit from and continue to distract from issues like releasing the Epstein files, all by claiming that they cured the scourge of autism caused by Big Pharma. And here's why this is so dangerous. Because it scares pregnant people away from safe care, which pushes them towards pain and fever or quack remedies with real risks. It vilifies autistic people by holding up the most support-intensive cases as the norm, and then lying about basic dignity like bathrooms when the reality is 0.06% of the population needs levels of support like that. It steals resources from what works. It steals resources from early screening and speech and language access and sensory accommodations, and it pours them into miracle shopping lists with a promo code. It prevents real research from getting funded. It prevents the real interventions, and it makes the lives of autistic people worse just so that you can sell a tincture of hopes and dreams. It teaches the public to treat epidemiology like a horoscope reading. See 2 lines, spin a story, sell a bottle. It licenses cruelty because once you convince people that autism is an avoidable injury, you make autistic lives look like a policy failure rather than a fact of human variety. And parents don't need guilt. Autistic kids don't need exorcisms. They need an educated public and some grace and some fucking support. And here is the boring but hopeful truth. If your child is autistic, the most powerful thing you can do isn't to hunt for a poison. It's to build scaffolding, teach communication, shape environments, fund classrooms, train employers, because autism is a way the brain develops. And you do not have to love every challenge that it brings, but you can love the person it brings you. And trust me, I get it. As someone who is neurodivergent, I know it is not easy. I know that I am fortunate for the functional person that I am, and it was the care and structure and intention that put me on the right path, and that effort like that has a mental and emotional and even financial costs, and those costs rise with the severity of a child's condition. So I get wanting to feel like there is a way out, that there is a cure, because you want what is best for your child. But that is why a false narrative and unrelated medications are so incredibly dangerous. So yes, we have to call out this grift. A politician who ignores a 2.5 million child study, waves a shaky review, and then points you to a checkout button is not protecting your family. He is monetizing them. And so here is my closing message to the men that are driving this panic. Trump, who could stare down a bottle of vitamins and declare bankruptcy. An RFK Jr., whose medical knowledge seems to come only from Facebook groups. Autistic people are not your talking point, not your prop, and not your product pipeline. Neurodivergent people were here before your charts and will be here well after your supplements are on clearance. And so if you truly care about children's health, stop chasing household objects and fund supports. If you care about the science, stop cherry-picking the foggy thing and read the big picture. And if you care about truth, which we know you don't, try saying it aloud that autism doesn't need a cure, people need care. Because at the end of the day, RFK Jr. isn't fighting for autistic kids. He's fighting for a story where he is the hero and the register rings. And if there is one thing we've learned tonight, it is this. The only thing RFK Jr. has ever definitively cured is a brain worm of its own will to live.